And thank you also to our panel. It's really interesting to have a more diverse range of speakers than we normally do, and I think to have people from both the policy areas and the advocates in those areas as well as researchers it's a really valuable opportunity to bring us together. This afternoon, being the last speaker, I want to bring a bit of a focus, return our focus to pay equity, if you like, which was one of the main themes, of course, of today, and also to women and motherhood. And I say that in honour of our speaker, Carla Harris, who will be, in that role very quickly, and, well, not too quickly, I hope, Carla. But, yes, true. So, look, it's very important for us to understand these connections, and I think the presentations of Yolanda, Carla and Mariah have already started to bring those things together. What I'd like to do is, I suppose, return to the very initial question we had about what are we talking about when we talk about the gender pay gap? And I appreciated the work that Carla has and her reference group have done on trying to tease this out. What I've got there is the headline figure, the one that Carla talked about, average weekly ordinary time earnings, which is the one that most people would refer to. And as we can see, Equal Pay Day in Australia was yesterday, 3rd of September. And that is calculated by what often appears to be quite a complicated mechanism, and it's usually quite hard to explain, but I've taken this directly from your website, so it's quite useful. It's a measure of the additional 64 days the average woman would have to work in order to earn what the average man took home in the previous financial year. And the calculation is based on the average weekly full-time ordinary time earnings data from the ABS, which is exactly the discussion that Carla introduced to us. There are other measures of the gender pay gap. One of the other commonly cited ones, of course, is the hourly pay gap between men and women. And the other data I've put up there in not a very fancy format, so my colleagues Leanne and Ray will say you could have done better there, Marian, but I was rushing. Just a list of the different states. And I think that's really informative as well, because as soon as you see the pay gap in those different states, you immediately begin to understand what are some of the factors that then are feeding into that pay gap, and it's quite obvious there that industry makes a big difference, and occupation, and of course those two things are quite related. So look, it's that background that we're talking about. That's the first thing. What do we need to do to address that pay gap? As many people have noted, it hasn't decreased in the last 15 to 30 years, and in fact it's starting to increase slightly again. But of course, if we want to look at statistically relevant or statistically significant differences, we have to do comparisons by year. But the big thing is that it hasn't shifted. So some things are remaining the same, despite all the changes that have occurred in education, in policy, and in the shape, size, and I suppose description of jobs that people now do. So it is a very persistent and difficult issue to shift. So my research, however, takes us into a slightly different area, and I'm going to report on some data about small business. And I'm relating this because when we talked about holding this event, it was noted that often small business are talked about, but we don't have as much information about them, and we often don't report on what is going on in small business. One of the reasons being that it's much harder to do the research, or hasn't been done in small business to the degree that it has been done in large businesses. One of the reasons larger organisations have been studied more often is, one, they allow access, it's easy to get into, and two, they collect a lot more data, so it makes it easier to actually use them as the point of reference. But as you know, one of the jobs and pleasures I've had has been on a large evaluation team evaluating the paid parental leave scheme, the scheme that was introduced by the Labor government and began in 2011. So it hasn't been going that long, but we had the opportunity to undertake employer and family survey and interview data in 2010, before the scheme was introduced, repeat that in 2011 and 2012. So we've got a natural experiment going on. What happens before a policy like that is introduced, and then what happens after. In order to do that, we collected a considerable amount of data from mothers and we also collected a lot of data from employers. And what I'm going to report on here is just the employer data with an emphasis, selected stats on the employer data, with an emphasis on small business because of our focus today. And I hope that in questions and discussion and perhaps the commentary we will have from COSBOA, which will be very valuable, is a way of trying to draw all these different areas of knowledge together and try and work out what the connecting issues are. So this is an evaluation survey of 501 organisations. They are randomly selected and they are representative of the Australian population of employers, and they were weighted for size. And we broke out the organisational size, small 2 to 19, so this doesn't include sole owner. What's the correct terminology? Sole trader, thank you. Or owner, yeah, doesn't include sole trader. 2 to 19, medium 20 to 199, and large is 200 plus. So, you know, depending on what statistics you're using, which surveys you use, sometimes large is 500 plus. In this particular study, it's 200 plus. So I really want to report on two lots of results. First is the statistically modelling of whether which employers provide paid maternity leave, and which employers provide paid maternity leave of more than 12 weeks duration. So remember, this was taken in 2011, the first year of operation of the paid parental leave scheme. And secondly, we have data on what did employers do in response to the introduction of that scheme. Because interestingly, when a government scheme is introduced like that, quite a dramatic change in what governments were producing before, we don't really understand how employers respond. So that's what I want to report on as well. So this is the first lot of data, and we won't spend too long on it. We can talk about it further later. But here we have employer paid leave by organisational size. So this is, did the employer or the business offer their own paid maternity leave scheme or paid paternity leave scheme or paid primary carers leave scheme, as a percentage of each of those groups. They could answer to more than one of those, so don't expect those numbers to add to 100. And as we can see there, when we look at small employers, only 11% provided paid maternity leave, and 85% provided none. And then as you go up in size, you see that larger organisations were much more likely to provide paid maternity leave, were more likely to provide paid paternity leave, and more likely to provide paid primary carers leave. So this really is probably not a surprise. We do know that organisational size really counts when it comes to providing such provisions. There's a lot of discussion about why that is the case. And that was one of the reasons why the Labor government opted for a minimum rates scheme, and one that would cover all employees, and was funded from general revenue. So small business were not asked to contribute to that scheme. Neither were big business in that plan either. We also asked what was the duration of the leave that companies provided, and again we see a very big difference by size. So small and medium-sized organisations are significantly less likely than large organisations to offer paid maternity leave, and I've just gone through that. But they're also significantly less likely to offer longer periods of paid maternity leave. So small organisations, 5.6 or 5.5 times less likely than large organisations to offer paid maternity leave of less than 12 weeks. It's a funny way of putting it. I know it's a statistical sort of thing. So they're 5.5 times less likely to offer short durations of paid maternity leave, and they're 14.5 times less likely to offer paid maternity leave of 12 weeks or more. And 12 weeks plus had become a norm by 2011. So in all, if you are working in a small business, and you're an employee in a small business, you're likely to have much less access to paid maternity or parental leave, and if you do, its duration will be shorter. I did that one the wrong way around. The second lot of questions we asked were about, well, if the government has introduced a new scheme, what were the employers' reactions to that? And in this particular question, we asked whether they had made any changes to their own paid maternity, paternity or primary carers leave policies in the lead up to the introduction of the government scheme. And this is going to become quite an interesting discussion after Saturday if we see a change in government and if we see a completely different parental leave or maternity leave scheme introduced. Because here we see that, in fact, it was medium-sized companies that responded most in terms of policy change. Small companies were very unlikely to have made a policy change, and big companies or large above 200 were not as likely as well. The explanation for that, I think, goes to the way in which business operates. If you're a small company, it was probably less likely to have a formal policy around maternity or parental leave anyway. If they were a large company, they were more likely to have a policy, as we'd seen, and that policy was probably more likely to be in an enterprise agreement or something that sort of codified it more strongly and made it less likely that they would change the scheme quickly. It would take time to make changes there. The second area of interest we had there was, okay, well, maybe those companies weren't making changes in terms of formal policy, but were they changing their practices around parental leave? And this went to things like, did they change their hiring and selection practices when they were employing people? Did they change the information they were providing their managers or their employees? What other sorts of practice changes might they make? And again, we see that small businesses were, on the whole, unlikely to have made any change to any of their employment practices. And again, it's medium-sized companies that were responding more in this area and not the large companies, although the difference is not as great there. So the overall picture we had in terms of responding to government policy change was that small business do not respond in formal ways, and they also don't respond in terms of their day-to-day practices. That doesn't mean to say that things weren't happening in small businesses, it's just that it wasn't being reported on in that way. Of course, the other area that received enormous attention in the lead up to the introduction of the paid parental leave scheme and following that, and even on the steering group where we're reviewing how the scheme is operating, was whether or not small business should be the pay administrator of the scheme. And that probably became the most contentious aspect of the Labor Party scheme. Around the world, it's a fairly unique feature of the current scheme in Australia, and it was designed explicitly and recommended by the Productivity Commission as a way of enhancing that connection between the employer and the recipient. So it was a sort of a mechanism to say, all right, although the employer is not actually paying this money, the advantage to the employer is if the employee receives that money through their general wage packet, they will make that connection between the employment place that they're in and this particular payment. It may be that that actually hasn't happened. We are collecting data on that and looking at that at the moment. It's too early to report on that. But certainly there was considerable small business opposition to this aspect of the scheme. And you may have seen very recently, I think about a week ago, or maybe just maybe it was a week and a half ago now, the Rudd Labor government did respond, and they have said that from September 30th this year, the government will pay eligible employees of these small businesses directly. So small business will not be obliged to be the pay administrator of the paid parental leave scheme, reducing the time small businesses spend on administering these payments, which probably goes to some of the things Maria's picked up and Yolanda's picked up about the frustration with what's typically called red tape. Whether that's accurate or not, that is a response to that complaint. And however, they have allowed an opt-in option. So if small businesses do want to opt in and still be the pay administrator, they can. But that is the most significant change that we've seen to the parental leave scheme. So in conclusion, We would say that size does count when it comes to this aspect of employment. Small organisations are significantly less likely to offer paid maternity leave. They're 8 times less likely than large organisations to offer paid maternity leave, and they're 14.5 times less likely to offer that leave of 12 weeks plus duration. Small businesses are very unlikely to have made any changes to their policies or practices following the introduction of the government paid parental leave scheme. And the government has responded, perhaps some would argue belatedly, but they have responded to the small business complaints, and no longer will small business employers have to pay or be the pay administrator of the parental leave scheme, but they can opt into that scheme. So I hope that's some food for thought. Happy to discuss some of the other findings if you have questions, but I think for now we might try and link those results with some of the other discussion and presentations we've had this afternoon. Thank you very much.